Probably the most asked question we get is now, how did you all get started in this? Been doing this for 10 years. What's that all about? Well, let me explain that with a story. Several years ago, we read a book by the author Gary Smith. Gary Smith comes from a very small town in the Midwest, and he tells the story from his youth when a carnival came to his town. And he, like all the young men, wanted to take a ride in the Ferris wheel. So he got on the Ferris wheel that day, and the Ferris wheel stopped at the top, and Gary looked out, and oh my gosh, he saw a lake filled with sailboats he had never seen before. He saw an interstate highway filled with trucks and cars. He saw wheat fields that stretched to the horizon. He never had seen any of that before. Came down from the Ferris wheel that day, and he said, "My little town never looked the same again. My little town never looked the same again." Gary called that a Ferris wheel experience of life. And I think that's something we all can relate to. Experiences, a loved one, a death of a loved one, joining a particular church, an event that really changed how we saw our world and how we responded to it. Kate and I have to confess, we had a Ferris wheel experience 10 years ago when we visited Kenya. Now I say visited Kenya, it was really a pilgrimage. Now a pilgrimage, that's kind of a religious word, but let me kind of break that apart and explain what that was for us. A pilgrimage, and for us it began with an encounter, relationships. We went to live with Kenyans. We lived on the grounds of a mission hospital. We were 200 feet away from a 250-bed hospital. At that hospital, they birth 6,000 children a year, so it's a very active hospital. We were 25 feet away from an HIV/AIDS clinic that cares for 4,250 patients on a monthly basis, men, women, and children. We were on the grounds also with a school, a 3-classroom school that taught the children of the poorest of the poor. Those would be the tea picker children in that particular area, and they lived around there. On the grounds are also 350 workers that worked in the hospital. Across the street from us there were several doctors and an accountant. The point was, we were not on a bus tour. We got to know Kenyans face to face. We put names with faces. They knew us by name, and we talked to each other. And that's an encounter, but we also sensed and felt pain. We sensed and felt pain. I recall one of the first, one of our first trips, we visited a clinic, HIV/AIDS clinic. Most of the patients came into Nazareth, but because there was a large concentration in some parts of the city, they actually would establish a clinic in that part of the city. And this particular clinic was in Korogocho, one of the major slums in Nairobi. And it was so large and the mortality was so high that we actually had to we actually established a hospice there where people could go and die who didn't want to be seen by their family dying. And I recall we went there that particular day. The hospice was in 2-room, women here, the men there, probably a 6-by-6 room, very small. On the women's side, there was an older teen dying. Mother sat on the edge of the bed. On the men's side, there was a man laying on a bed. He was dying. And they said, "Would you please pray for that man?" Oh, my heart went into my throat. I'd never done anything like that. But the point was, we one-on-one sensed and felt that pain. We also sensed hope, and Kate's going to talk about that in a second. But not only did we encounter and establish relationships, but we wanted to reflect on that. We wanted to reflect on that. What I mean by that, I don't know if you've ever been on a vacation where you take a couple hundred photographs and you get back and you bore all your friends to death with all your photographs. And after a while, you put the photographs on the bureau, and they begin to fade, and they begin to get dusty, and finally you store them away. They're gone. They're gone. We didn't want that to happen. We knew we were seeing something very special. We wanted to hold on to that encounter. We wanted to be able to reflect on that. How do we do that? One of the ways I did that with through God's Word. I recall reading God's Word while I was there, and God somehow, God's amazing, it's living, His Word. He kept leading me to the passages where Jesus healed the blind man. It must have been 6 blind men, I guess, in the gospel that Jesus healed. And the amazing thing is I read those stories, it was more than a medical healing. It was a medical healing, they could see. But they began to see something they had never seen before. And I realized that that's what God was doing to me. I was seeing something that I'd never seen before. Kate and I expressed our feelings between ourselves. We began to wrestle with what we had seen. We began to wrestle with the issues. We began to wrestle with our own ignorance about Africa. So many people say, well, how'd the election go in Africa? Well, Africa is not a country, it's a continent. In fact, you know how big the continent of Africa is? You could get 3.5 United States into Africa. It's a huge continent. But as I came away from that trip, we said, if we saw the continent of Africa, I don't think I could point out where Kenya was. I didn't know the countries surrounding Kenya. We were ignorant of that. I recall the first trip we came back, we went over to Barnes & Noble, our first trip, and we bought a children's book of African maps. And we began to learn about Africa because we wanted to reflect on what we had experienced. Finally, the important part was really the transformation. A transformation for us, I guess you had to say, it started when we went over, but I think it really showed itself the next year in 2008. God's timing's perfect. In early 2008, we both realized we could retire. It was probably 2 years before we had planned on retiring. By the way, Kate and I are newlyweds. We both moved here in 2000. We lost, both of us lost. I moved from South Florida. Kate moved from Virginia Beach. We both lost our spouses to cancer, and we moved to downtown Norfolk. We didn't know each other. We lived about 2 blocks apart, but we met at the YMCA. So that's why we like the YMCA. And we still go to the YMCA. But anyway, we met each other, and we started this journey. But we realized we could retire, and some things were changing on the Kenyan side, requiring some more oversight. And I recall saying to Kate, came home, I said, we could go over for a month this year. We're retired now. Kate said, why not 3 months? Kate's the adventurer. She's going to tell you about that in a second. But that really did begin our adventure. We've made 21 trips. Kate has made 23. She's gone on 2 by herself. And we spent about 1,100 days in country over the last 10 years. But I'd like Kate to share with you some of the personalities, some of the folks that we have met in that period of time.
Well, as you can imagine, over the course of 10 years, we have made many relationships and have had many encounters. And I'd just like to share a few of them with you. We met Alice in 2007 on our first trip. She was one of a group of children that would come to our porch in the evenings and on the weekends to do puzzles and checkers and just to play and have a safe place to come. With the exception of some teenagers, the group ranged from maybe 4 to 7 years old, including Alice. But Alice had a maturity about her that made her stand out. She would handle little disputes and make sure the children, were behaving, and she would make sure they would clean up after themselves. And if the boys were rowdy, she could cut them down with a look. We knew we had to find out more about this feisty, spunky, lovely young lady. She had stolen our hearts. Just across from the hospital, there is a shanty village with dwellings of corrugated metal, maybe 1 or 2 room homes, and that's where Alice lived with her grandmother. Alice, at the age of 5, had lost her mother, father, and her only sibling to AIDS. Alice was HIV positive, and at the time she was actually about 10 years old. We were told that some of the earlier medications used to treat the virus that she had taken rendered her body incapable of storing fat. So she has little stick legs, little thin arms, and just a petite body, but she's got powerful lungs. Gotta give her. We didn't really have to know Kiswahili, which is the national language, or Kikuyu, which is the mother tongue of the area, to know that Alice was in charge. And when she spoke, everybody listened. But she did have a difficult life, and her appearance stigmatized her. She was often ridiculed by her peers. She was shunned sometimes by her peers. But she continued to have a wonderful attitude, and she just had determination. So where did Alice get that from? Where did she get that strength to just move forward in the midst of her challenges? She got it from her faith. Alice's faith and her hope were humbling. She had no doubt that God's grace was going to give her protection, guide her, give her the stamina to move forward and reach her goals. Alice is sponsored in high school now, and she wants to be an accountant. We think she should be a teacher, but Alice wants to be an accountant. She has her mind set on that. And we're hopeful that that will be the case. She's often, because of her immune system being depressed, she's often ill. She comes down with pneumonia frequently, other rest with TB, and she's often ill. But we sometimes worry, will she be there when we come back? But she's continued to grow. She's strong, and she has challenges. She's actually got the love and support of a very caring grandmother. But that's not the case for all the orphans in Kenya, unfortunately. There are many who have no one to look after them. Traditionally, in this culture, an orphan is taken care of by the grandmother or an extended family, the aunts, the uncles, even the community or the village will absorb them and take care of them. Kenyans have large families. Now, usually I would guess maybe 5 children to a family. I don't have any statistics to back that up. It's just pure observation over the years. They have large families. So I would say maybe an average of 5. Now that mom has 5 children, and her children will have 5 children. So that leaves her with 25 grandchildren. Well, then comes the pandemic of AIDS, and you multiply that by 1,000, that scenario. Grandma's left, the pandemic will take maybe 3, 4, or 5 of your children. And who's left to care for them? There are no aunts and uncles, they're gone as well. So there's a lot of suffering, and there is just a lot of need. We saw it firsthand. We were approached in 2008 by some of the social workers that we work with at the hospital and the clinic, and they asked us, would we open a children's home, especially for HIV positive children, because nobody wants them. And we said, how could you say no? We knew nothing about it, but we couldn't say no. We had seen the suffering. How we got there is a story for another time. It's another long story. But in 2011, we opened up the Children's Joy Village. They don't call them orphanages there, they call them children's villages or children's homes. We did this in partnership with Nazareth Hospital, and when we opened the doors, we had 20 children waiting for us. And today, Rudy and I are the proud surrogate grandchildren of 60. We expect 10 more next year, but we have great grandparents, exactly. We did encounter 2 young girls We were asked one morning by our director at the Joy Village if we could accompany her to a local village to assess two girls that she had been told about. We work closely with Compassionate International over in Kenya, and one of the volunteers that we know well asked us if we would look at the situation of two children. Their names are Kate and Sharon, and when we arrived, we found the children. They were filthy, they were frightened, they were malnourished. Their mother and paternal grandmother, who they lived with, were prostitutes and alcoholics and would leave them for weeks at a time. So the girls would steal food or beg for food, and sometimes neighbors would, try to take care of them. We visited the dwelling where they lived, and we found there was one bed, and we were told that's where the uncle sleeps. And it was soon found out that he had defiled the older girl. So we knew we needed to take these children right away, but you just can't pick children, just like you can't pick them here or just take them. It's a long legal process. But the village chief is a powerful figure in these communities, and we were able, through him, to get a document releasing the children to our temporary custody. So we took them immediately to the Nazareth Hospital, and they were fed, they were scrubbed, they were comforted, and they were examined. And it was confirmed that the older girl had been raped by her uncle, and we did file a police report. But we're happy to say that Sharon and her sister Kate were welcomed with song and dance and love. We did bring the children to the Joy Village, and they are now being nurtured by their new mother and their caring grandparents, us, and their new siblings, and they have an extended family. There are several families on the grounds of the compound. That's just two encounters. There are many, but I'm going to leave that to Rudy. He's going to tell us about Matumo.
Let me just say, Kate is modest. When Sharon and her sister reached Nazareth Hospital, it was determined that the younger sister didn't have a name. Could you imagine that? The mother had never named that young girl, and she was named Kate. So we thank you, Kate, for sharing that. From our early times in Kenya, we were always encouraged to see more. We were encouraged to do some travel, to see the experience of others, other locations. And one of the areas that really has caught us and caught our heart is an area called Matumo. Matumo is southeast of Nairobi. It is down towards Mombasa. Don't you like that word? Mombasa. Which is the largest seaport in East Africa. And it somewhat parallels the coast of Somalia. Somalia kind of dribbles along the side of Kenya. My notes said it's arid. It's not arid. It's very arid. The first time we went, they were experiencing a 2-year drought. Now again, this is an agricultural-based area, so they had not seen rain in 2 years. We asked what we could bring as we were planning for our trip, and they said, well, bring water, bring carrots, and bring cabbage. We weren't quite certain what the cabbage and carrots were for, but it turned out it was for vegetables for the hospital. They have a hospital there, Matumo Mission Hospital. You'll see it in a second. And we also were told to be prepared to eat dust. It's a very dusty area. And someone said a picture is worth 1,000 words, so maybe I can save myself some words here.
Wonderful, merciful Savior, precious Redeemer and friend. Who would have thought that the Lord could rescue
Well, what's unique about Matumo? Why would we even want to go to Matumo? Matumo is home for about 18,000 people. Because of the size, they're spread out. It's agricultural based, so if you're going to grow something normally, or you're going to have goats, normally you need a lot of land to do that. So they are spread out over that area. Because of that distance, to go to the hospital at Matumo, it's probably a 4-hour walk for you. Oftentimes, people in Matumo, to go for water, it's an 8-hour walk. The men would walk at night, the women would only walk during the day. Also, Matumo is unique in that it has the highest percentage of HIV children of any area of Kenya. And the reason is because of those distances. A woman, if she wants to birth at the hospital, she'd oftentimes wait till the last minute. She can't be tested, so she may give birth to a HIV positive child because she doesn't realize she's HIV positive herself, or even have a home birth. Because of that, and I want to also say, it is also unique because of the hope. The staffing at Matumo is exceptional. It's exceptional. I'm so glad we went there almost 10 years ago now. And it's exceptional because of their work with youth. Youth are a real issue when you're dealing with HIV/AIDS. A couple of reasons. We have between us 4 children. We've all seen them go through those teen years. Things are beginning to change. They're beginning to question things. But yet, they're HIV positive, and chances are their parents are dead. But they're wondering, can they live a normal life? Will I have to take these pills every day of my life? Will I be able to marry? Will I be able to have children? They're asking those questions. They're struggling with issues like that. And also they're facing, I should say, because of that struggle, we find that when you look at the age segments of society, that the teens have the highest mortality rate, have the highest suicide rate. It's horrible. Shouldn't happen. But the staff at Matumo has worked with that group over the last few years. You saw several slides there of about a dozen young people dressed as cooks or chefs. And a couple of years ago, they brought a trade school over to Matumo just for a couple of weeks session. They trained them to be cooks. They trained them to work food service, and they all got jobs. The hospital hired about 3 of them. They found jobs in the city. Some have gone on with the money they've earned at that profession, and they've gone on to other trades, or they've even started businesses. Several years ago, Matumo also was experiencing a critical shortage of medical workers, and I'm speaking of nurses right now. RNs in Kenya, they're a very important part of medical care. They handle much more than a nurse would in this country. They're well trained. They're trained over a 3.5-year period. They're trained at licensed schools. And Matumo decided to start their own school. That's taken them about 2 years to get going, and that's because of all that was necessary to start that movement. And we understand within about 2 months their nursing school will open, and they hope to be able to utilize many of the youth that have come through the program for that. As I reflect on Matumo, I also carry with me an image, a person in my heart, and that's a little girl named Kambua. In one of our early trips to the mission hospital there, we were having a children's day. It started early, and about 10 o'clock everybody was there already, and they were working, but we saw a little girl walking towards the hospital. And asked Kushi, well, that's Kambua. She's late because she had to walk 4 hours to get there that morning. And somehow she found me. I don't know, it's that grandfather look or something. But Kambua sat in my lap. She did a little drawing, and then it was time for a break. It was time for breakfast. Kambua helped herself to 4 pieces of white bread. That would be a breakfast. And a little milk, those little containers of milk you saw there. And I was busy doing some things. She sat on my lap, and before long I realized Kambua was sleeping. And she had walked a long way. But as she slept, I looked down at her head, top of her head and back of her head, and she had some horrible scars. She had, they call them cerebral abscesses, probably earlier. They've healed over, but she'll carry those scars with her. She was also malnourished. See, Kambua is HIV positive, as is her younger sister, as is her mother. We didn't know the status of the father at that point in time. But as Kambua slept, I also looked down, I saw she didn't have any shoes. Now, I'm not saying that every child in Kenya has shoes, but especially if they're walking long distances, they at least have flip-flops. So what we did, I said, we need to do something about that. So we drew an outline of her foot on a piece of paper, and I sent one of the helpers down into the city. And what'd she come back with, Kate?
Pair of pink Mary Janes.
Bubblegum pink shoes. And we slipped them on Kambua's feet while she was still sleeping. And when she woke up, she had the biggest smile I've ever seen. It was probably her first pair of shoes. And she very proudly walked back with her mother that evening with a pair of shoes. In subsequent visits, we've been able to travel to her home. It took us about 2 hours to get there with a four-wheel drive vehicle. So she lives a long way from the hospital. Imagine she walked it, we drove it. But her father has died. But Kambua is healthier. She's a teenager now. She has a younger sister. Her younger sister's doing well. And the mother, we've met all three. In fact, the last shots, that was actually in Kambua's homestead. They moved in with an uncle, so they have like a family compound. Some of you are probably wondering, where do we go from here? What's next? It's our prayer to see 6 of these youth go to nursing school. That would be so critical, not only for the youth, but for that community, for that hospital. How do you make that happen? The way you make it happen, this is not a charity. A charity you just write a check to and you go home. I think it's up to each of us, if that's on your heart or in your mind, to draw a line around a person's foot, around their life. You own it. You own that relationship with that person. You can help a particular person. And that's what we're looking at for youth at Matumo. The cost of going to nursing school, it would be a partial scholarship. That's the best way to do it. In Kenya, the cost is about $2,500 for 3.5 years. They live on the grounds. It's not a school that they just go to once a day. They actually live there. They work in the hospital. It takes 3.5 years to become an RN. They're certified by the government. They have to pass a number of tests. Since we began talking about this, a couple in Christ in St. Luke's has agreed to care for two of those children. So we're on our way.